103.2 Preston FM.
We dare to be different.
Now, the traditional image of recruitment in 1914 is of an initial wave of enthusiasm and volunteering greeting the outbreak of war. And to talk more about recruitment, I've got in the studio with me David Huggonson. So, David, a very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Nice to meet you once again. So, I know you've got a talk, I think, coming up soon at the Harris Museum. And is it specifically around recruitment? And
it is on recruitment. It's more specifically on the work I've done on the Preston Pals. So I'm looking, it's only from about 2 till 3 on next Thursday at the Harris, and its focus is on looking, I've only got an hour and I've got a lot to put in, so I'm focusing on letters of Preston Powell. He was called Sergeant Rawcliffe, and I'm using his letters to try and tell the story, and I'm going to try and put in as much of the research as I can as possible and try and maybe educate and get rid of a few of the myths, because there's a myth that the Preston Pals were slaughtered during the Battle of the Somme, and there's a certain amount of myth to that. So there's a lot of stuff that says yes there was, but there's a lot of stuff that says there isn't. So if you want to find out a little bit more about that and a lot more about the personalities,
well, and without giving too much away on the radio now, because I'm sure people will want to come out and find out. I mean, I'm just fascinated by what you've just said. I mean, why is there that myth?
It's a good question. Maybe it's because of the way newspaper reporting was at the time, because there was a slight delay after the Battle of the Somme with regards to all the obituaries, because they didn't want to tell everyone about the slaughter. So, and there's also perhaps because there was actually in one of the Harry Cartmel, who was a mayor at the time, he did an autobiography, and one of his speeches he said about how it was such a tragedy about the death of the Preston Pals, and maybe it was just one of those things that just passed through word by mouth at the time. But having looked at some of the census work and looked at the names and addresses of people and looked who actually died and who didn't, it's come across some interesting facts, in which I should be bringing up in the talk.
Right. And for listeners who maybe don't know, tell us a little about Preston Pals.
Well, the Preston Pals was set up by Cyril Cartmel. He was the son of Harry Cartmel, who was the mayor at the time. He put an advert in the local paper, which it was the predecessor of the Lancashire Evening Post, which was called Lancashire Daily Post. And he asked for, I've forgotten the number of men, but he wanted people who were in like middle class, so solicitors and that type of background or employment, to come and join together. At the time, there was such popularity for the Pals, where people can go and join up with their friends and buddies, people who they grew up with, and obviously he tapped into this enthusiasm. And ironically, I don't know if it's irony, but when you look at the names and addresses, because there was actually a list printed in the paper and their departure, they weren't actually all middle class. There was actually a lot from working class backgrounds, and it's a really representative of what Preston society was like at that time.
And although they're called Preston Pals, there were also kind of pals in Accrington and other parts of the county, wasn't there?
Well, Preston's doesn't seem to be, it's not as famous as the Accrington Pals, mainly because of, I think, its size, because Accrington recruited around, I think it was about 1,000 men. They had a whole regiment. We only recruited a company, which is I think around 250. We actually didn't get permission for a second company. I don't know, it's just one of those, and maybe because of the size of Accrington and the way they reported on the 1st of July, that could have actually perhaps fed into why, Preston Pals, we had a Pals, and they were all slaughtered, and it's quite
I mean, last night I was having a look, and I was absolutely fascinated by the First World War I propaganda posters, which I didn't know much about, and one of them particularly was "Women of Britain Say Go," and some of the other posters, "Your country's call, isn't this worth fighting for?" Were those posters in those days very strong incentives, do you think, to get people to sign up? Because I was fascinated looking at these posters last night.
I certainly say that I don't know much about the posters themselves, about how much put around, but there was Sergeant Rawcliffe, who was the Pals, did actually mention about big posters were put up all over the place, and so I can certainly imagine that there was a lot of pressure to go, but I think there may be more pressure from people in society because of the white feathers. And a lot of things. I know eventually, as recruitment went on, men actually got armbands to declare that they actually had signed up, so there was less pressure to go. So I can certainly imagine there was a lot of pressure.
And of course, probably the most famous one is the Kitchener one, isn't it? Your country needs you.
Yeah, your country needs you, and 100,000 men wanted.
That's right. I mean, when you think about it now, given where we are today with social media, I suppose in those days, posters probably was one of the main things that people actually saw everywhere. They were probably plastered everywhere.
Yeah.
And presumably, you felt guilty that if you didn't. Do you think there was a lot of that in the recruitment here in Preston? Do you think people did get caught up in this thing about war and whatever, and wanting to go off to fight for their country?
I suppose, yeah, there's probably a certain amount of people wanting to do their bit for king and country, and I think a lot of people signed up because they were with their buddies, or they got incentive because some of Preston's major firms actually advertised saying that we'll give you a certain amount of subsidy for you or your partner, or we'll keep your job for here when you go back. And there was a lot of that in some of Preston's largest cotton and mill firms, and I think the council as well, or Preston Borough Council at the time, did that as well. But the strange thing was, compared to say like London and stuff, Preston's recruitment boom didn't start until late August. I don't know the major reason for that, and it was so large to the extent that Preston's barracks was overwhelmed very, very quickly, because they only had like accommodation for around 1,000 men, and considering like there was a newspaper report I think later in that month which said about 10,000 men may have been recruited up until then. That's if you count the number of men per regiment, and whether you believe it's exaggeration or not. But it's, if you're thinking thousands of men coming in that problem, in that sort of short amount of time, there were problems accommodation wise, like I just mentioned. But Preston, just took it in its spirit. There's lots of stories of individuals bringing in individuals to look after or to stay with them for a couple of days. They did marquee tents. They put them in the biggest buildings they had in Preston, which at the time was the public hall, which is now the Assembly. That was opened. Tram stations, I think the train station. So it was a very, very busy time, and I'm sure if you're living at that time, you must have thought, wow, there's absolutely all sorts going on here.
And so recruitment began later then here in Preston.
Well, recruitment was started quite early on because of the mobilisation of the reservists and the territorials and everyone who were the existing troops. They went out quite early on. So, but Kitchen's advertisements didn't start till later on. I think it might have been about mid-August when his PALS idea came along. In fact, the PALS idea came about with Lord Derby in Liverpool. He wanted to create an entire regiment using the largest firms and mills in Liverpool, and from there that was so popular that was taken up in Manchester, and then it spread to the small towns such as Preston. So the idea of that came about perhaps later in the month, but recruitment's, I don't know exactly when it started, but I think it might have been open certainly from the beginning of the war.
And do we know how long it was after people signed up before they actually went off to fight? Did they stay around the city for quite some time in the barracks?
I think initially to an extent, yeah, but because of the rush of accommodation, one of the things that the local authorities, certainly in Preston, came up with to sort of ease this was to send men off who were recruited straight off to the training regiments, so they only stayed not for very long. In fact, they went off to the training regiments without any equipment. Yeah. They bundled them straight off, obviously try and ease it. So, but I know that Preston PALS, the advert was in the paper for only around 3 days before they got all the numbers, and they left probably about 4 days after that left, you see. So there's only a certain amount of time that they left, and obviously it must have been just a case of how things were running then, that they thought we can't keep them here too long, so we've got too many men coming in.
And of course there are quite a few stories, aren't there, of children underage who signed up. I think the youngest in World War One, was it something like 13 or 14?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there are stories, and presumably the same thing happened around here, that there would have been people underage.
I think I know of two stories. One is, there's one gentleman I say gentleman, but boy, I think I should say, his name is on the Harris Roll of Honour on the stairs, and he was actually in the Royal Navy, and it actually says boy on there. But I know of one Pacific gentleman, he was actually in the Preston PALS. I think he may have been 16, I'm not entirely sure of this. It's hard to find that sort of data, but there's letters saying about how he lost his leg, and he was, one of 3 boys who might have been underage. So it's very fascinating that people who were so young wanted to, go and do their bit.
And do we know, I mean, we're talking about recruitment and going off to war. Do we know how people were supported once they returned to Preston? I mean, were people looked after when they came back from war? I mean, we talked about that, you know, people were promised that their jobs would remain open. Did things like that happen? And were people helped who came back maybe seriously injured? Do we know much about that?
We do know a little that some of these jobs were kept open for people, but there are cases where even though they got the jobs kept open, they may not have been the exact same job, so they might not have got might have gotten demoted. They might not, because of their physical capabilities, might not be able to go and do their job. So they might have been in charge of overseeing mill workers, and because they've lost the legs, they can't physically move, or there's a case of lungs, or they've lost their eyesight. Or there was a lot of things during the war where they were helping out returning soldiers, but some of these, by the end of the war, have stopped functioning. So there's a big gap after the war as to exactly what happened. It's only after the war that we got all memorials, and we're really looking after our own. So yes, there were people helping out, but we're not entirely sure of a lot of that, you see.
And is there much written evidence from people who were from the area who were serving in the war? Do we have letters? Do we have anything that was written, diaries, etc., about the experience of people from Preston and surrounding areas? I
don't know about Preston specifically, but there's a lot in the Lancashire Infantry Museum. They've got a very large collection of serving soldiers during the war. In fact, of most of the war, a lot of the wars. And I've picked up some of their letters. There was a gentleman called, I think it was William Ord, and he was an officer who lived locally and who was well connected locally. I think one of his relatives was actually mayor at some point, or an alderman. But his wife, they wrote a lot of letters back and forth, and they shared a lot of experiences. So there are some, but there isn't a lot, unfortunately.
And I know last time we met, we were talking about your book, David, because for people who are interested, there is a book that is out at the moment, isn't it? And tell us a little about the book.
Well, the book covers, the book itself is called Preston and the First World War. It's kind of an easy title to remember.
Yes, and I read it and enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah, I've got a copy here in front of me, actually. And it covers the period of the war, and it covers like 1940 to 1918. And each chapter has a certain theme, so from women to working in industry to recruitment. And there's some contents of the Preston Pals in it, such as their famous battle and some of the key personalities, but I've kept a lot of it out of it. And a lot of that will be going into the talk. So if anybody wants to know any more information about what I've mentioned and or anything in particular, the book itself is probably the best source to go to. It's available in Waterstones, or you can get it on some of the larger websites on the internet, or straight from the publishers. And there's also my online site. I run a blog which runs in parallel with the book. In fact, it started before the book, and it's got local sources related to the war. So I've just put on like local church newsletters. So I've got on the absent voter list and much more. In fact, I've even got on Sergeant Rawcliffe, who is Preston Pal. His letters are all transcribed on there, and that's preston1914.wordpress.com, so it's quite easy to remember, or even just Google my name.
And how did, because I know you won't mind me saying you are a young man, so how did the interest come about for you in finding out more about World War I and putting the book together?
I've always been sort of interested in history, maybe since when going back to year 9, in thinking about your options for history or not, and then as I've gone along and just researching things, I've just become, I think like yourself, you said before, you become really interested in, because it's our town, it's our city, and it's one of the major events in 20th century, and thinking, how do we cope with it? And that sort of question it's just got me interested. And when I get my teeth into something, I go as far as I can with it.
And what were probably some of the biggest surprises in the research that you did that you didn't know?
Probably the individual stories of people. Because there's stories of people meeting
husbands
through helping out with accommodation, stories of people coming back that they've lost legs or relatives, or they've been gassed, or even down to how people were helping during the war, and even how the mayor himself and how the mayoress was helping, whether it's running committees of helping out women or making parcels and sending them off to the front for troops. It's just such the wider response to people, and I think I've just been mesmerised by how much was going on.
And I mean, do you think, I mean, we were recruiting people off to go and fight a war. We're talking about local people, so people were leaving families, they were leaving children behind, industry, the work in the industry. Were they treated, do you think, in those days in a fair kind of way, or was it very much that they were seen as being subservient and, you know, you must go off to fight a war?
It's really hard to answer that question because I've only got a few experiences of people, but there are, you know, a lot of experiences for families that they found it very harsh. For example, one daughter recalled her mother going out with an empty basket to do with the daily shop with all the rationing, and she came back crying because she had an empty basket because of the queues of people. Police were having to march people in and out. So, you know, I don't know about people being subservient, but I think as conscription came along, I think that there's a certain amount of people's hands were forced with regards to recruitment, so things were always going to be difficult.
Well, tell us then again the date of the talk. It's coming up. It's next week.
Yeah, it's the 28th from 2 till 3 at the Harris Museum. You can get tickets from the Harris Museum. I don't know how popular it's been, unfortunately, but I'm hoping for a good attendance, and it's going to be specifically on the Preston Pals. I've only got an hour and I've got a lot to put in.
And information that you've not yet released.
Yeah, well, I was hoping to try and do something with more of my original material for the Preston Pals. A lot of it's online, but I kept this all of it out of the book, but put some of it in. So maybe in the future, if I was to do a second edition of the book, a lot of my pals' work would go into it. So I'm exploring that at the moment. So until then, we'll have to do with the talk.
And what about the future? I mean, what plans for the future?
At the moment, I did a talk on the 4th of August as part of the commemorations at the town hall. We had a few people turn up, and I talked about the early months of the war. And I'm hoping over the next couple of years to sort of do that and carry on with that theme, and to continue telling the story of the first Preston in the First World War as much as we can chronologically. So I've done it up to October. I'm hoping to do another talk later this year. I'm trying to find somewhere to do it, and I've got another one planned next year. I've not released details yet, but it's around February, and it's part of the talks at the Lancashire Archives. So over the next few months, I am planning small talks. I think that's where I'm sort of going with things at the moment.
Right. Well, can I thank you for coming in this afternoon? And again, just remind us where people can go online to find out more.
www.preston1914.wordpress.com. I'll say it again now. It's www.preston1914.wordpress.com, or if you're not very good with computers, if you just Google David Huggonson, and you're bound to find something of me on there.
Brilliant. David, thank you for coming in this afternoon.
Thank you.
Made by people like you.
Your community.
Your radio.
Your Preston FM.